So since about 2012, the broad overview of how student loans have worked in the UK is that you go to university for 3 years. For this first bit, where you're actually at university, you pay nothing. And then once you graduate, you start paying interest on your student loan. £9,000 there or thereabouts per year is how much students pay to go to university in the UK, and that gets added to your loan. And some element of what's called a maintenance loan, which is an amount of money that you're given to live on. Full maintenance loan in the UK at the moment is, let's say, like about 10 grand. So your full loan by the end should be 19,000 times 3, about £57,000. And this will vary depending on how long you take. So if you retake a year, you'll pay an extra 19 grand if you do a longer course. So you might do a foundation year, or you might do a university access course. You might do a postgraduate qualification, so like a master's. For this period up here, you pay nothing. Then for the entire next period, the next 30 years, you'll pay 9% on all income over £28,000. When you're first being told about it, you're like, oh, 9% sort of nothing, right? But once you've paid your normal income tax and national insurance and stuff, the additional 9% actually becomes quite a chunk, right? The benefit of this system is that a student loan in the UK is never going to lead to a bailiff coming to your door, kicking it down and stealing all your stuff. But that doesn't mean that the payment isn't quite significant. Maybe the fact that there is a slightly higher threshold now makes it a bit less painful, although that's about to change. We're about to see. But 9% of like a bit of your income is not like nothing to be sniffed at, right? What happens eventually if after 30 years there is still any of your student loan left, the debt gets cancelled. So the student loan I have is called a Plan 1 student loan. They were the first student loans that were introduced after the government decided under Tony Blair that students should have to contribute towards paying for their education. So rather than just the government funding universities to provide a certain number of university places, students would also have to contribute towards the costs of the course. When I went to university, I was the last year prior to the introduction of this system, and it worked similar-ish. So this 30 years was still a thing where your debt got cancelled at the end of 30 years. The 9% was the same, although the figure was much lower, so it's 21 grand. The whole loan would be much lower, about £3,000 or £3,500, I think, that we were contributing towards the course a year rather than what it is, which is around £9,000. The government's now kind of updated this, and the new system is going to be Plan 5. I feel like if you keep having to add additional plans, it feels like a slight sign of failure at least. And so when you hit the 30 years, if you earn a significant amount, I mean like a pretty significant amount to actually be eating into this, what potentially happens is you pay the whole thing off. However, if there's anything left over, by the end of the 30 years, it gets cancelled. There is a certain kind of person who, if you are earning a significant amount, then potentially you pay it off before the end of the term. However, for most people these days, what happens is they don't pay off the loan. Because obviously, if the threshold is 28k, then you have to be earning over that to be paying anything off. In order to be paying anything like significant off at all, you have to be earning quite a lot over £20,000. So government forecasts I've just seen over here suggest that only about 30% of people actually pay that off. So for most people, functionally what they are signing up for is a 9% graduate tax, essentially, on all income over around 28 grand, depending on which particular loan plan that you're on. Every year they'll get an email that tells them how much their loan is worth and how much they've paid off or how much interest has been added. But all of that is realistically a kind of fictional nonsense that doesn't really matter because they're never going to pay the loan off anyway. So all they're really doing is paying 9% on income over whatever this specific amount is for their specific plan for 30 years. The actual loan amount, which is a number that you can log into the Student Finance England, which is the body that looks after these things, realistically, that's a pretend nonsense number. Because what you're actually signing up to do is pay 9% on all income over your threshold for 30 years, and then that number gets wiped off the screen. The new scheme changes this in a couple of ways. Firstly, the threshold for paying it back is going to get reduced to £25,000. So remember, it used to be £21,000. It did used to be lower than that, but this was back when interest rates on it were lower, and back when the principal amount of the loan was lower because the cost of going to university that was passed on to students was much lower. It's now going to be 9% on all income over £25,000. But at the same time, they've also increased the kind of amount of time after which you get this little debt jubilee, and students will only get the debt cancelled 40 years after graduation rather than 30 years. Which means not only are you paying more every month, because that 9% figure is now paid in everything over 25 grand rather than everything over 28, but also you're going to be paying for much longer, which essentially means that you'll be paying that 9% for most of your working life. In fact, if there was 10 years where you could probably benefit from not having to pay the 9%, it would probably be when you were younger, because having the money to put into your pension when you're 25 or to try and buy a house or whatever is going to be more beneficial. In effect, what we have is a ludicrous system by which presents itself as a loan in which there is a fixed amount which is being paid off over a certain amount of time, but which in practice is a 9% tax. However, it's a 9% tax which only really counts for poor people, because if you have wealthy parents, then what they'll do is they'll just pay your university fees when you first go to university, and therefore none of this system ends up affecting you one bit. Or perhaps you do take the loan, but you graduate, and after a couple of years, then your parents decide to pay off your university fees for you, and you can cut out this whole system. Because it sounds like it's kind of progressive in some ways, because it's lower paid people who are going to have their debt cancelled after 30 years, whereas it's the people who earn slightly more money who are going to potentially pay more. The most unlucky person to be would be someone who pays it off in 29 years, because then you'll have done all of that stuff to pay it off and you won't have got the benefit of any of it being written off. What we have here is we have a whole system which presents itself as a loan system in which after 30 years, the government's being really kind and writing off your debt. But in actual fact, what we have is a graduate tax. So again, my student loan is a Plan 1 student loan. I'm very fortunate to not be in quite this bad system of it. When I first took mine out, £21,000, which is the threshold at which I pay off mine, was a humongous amount. 28 grand at the moment, that scales with inflation, right? So now I think 21 grand might be just above minimum wage.